Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Today we've got a special treat, introducing Fiona Wood, Professor Fiona Wood, who's really needs no introduction, has got a number of accolades, as you know, but she's been involved in both the clinical care and burns research now for over 2 decades, and she's had outstanding contributions both to the clinical care of patients, of which she's had been in the media spotlight for taking care of survivors from the Bali bombings in 2002. She's been named a member of the Order of Australia, and she's also had outstanding contributions to burns science. And we're hoping that she'll update us today about some exciting findings in terms of her skin program. We're also hoping that this will lead to some very long-standing collaborations between the skin science that we're exploring here at IIID and the work she's doing in burns. So thanks so much. We're honored that you can come and talk to us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me here to kind of go through some of the things that I know some familiar faces you've heard before, but to try and put it all into context and as Elizabeth said, to try and challenge us in how we go further. I've been very, very fortunate in working with lots of people over a very long period of time that have helped me see things differently, and I don't profess to be competent in all these areas, but I am a surgeon. And as a surgeon, I see people on a daily basis who've suffered a trauma, burns trauma, and it's been my passion, and continues to be my passion, to try and understand the scope of the global scope of the technology and information out there that I can bring to bear to improve the quality of life of that person I'm dealing with at that point in time. And so over the years we've developed a program that really links the 3 elements of basic science, population health and clinical research, underpinned by education and training, because all our work has been focused on solving a clinical problem and taking that solution to the bedside. So I'm going to talk about the whole kind of 20 odd years, and I'll sort of skip over the bits at the beginning with the cell-based therapies and then try and drill down to where we want to go next. As co-inventor with Marie Stoner of the ReCell device, I declare the conflict of interest. You'll see some of this in work in the presentation. But also it was an area we may discuss later. Having realised what we were doing was different, Marie and I, we had this grand idea that if we assigned our intellectual property to a not-for-profit organisation, then the McCone Foundation, now the Fiona Wood Foundation, we would be able to use that intellectual property in a commercial sense to underpin the Foundation's research going forward. It's a naive but a very noble cause, and it's 20 years later, we're just getting traction as we've just got an $8 million grant from BARDA, which is associated with the Armed Forces Institute of Regenerative Medicine in the US, going through the FDA trial. And so once you get the FDA, then as you know, things start to move. And so it's an interestingly long gestation period, but we were very focused at the beginning on making the technology available across the world and funding our research. And as such, we've had no financial gain on the personal level. So this is really, I guess, burns care. And I'll try and sort of put it into context. A decade ago, I was asked to put into 100 words what I thought burns care would be like in 50 years' time. And I've got in my mind like a car wash. And you go to the first part of the car wash, and I want to assess. I want to assess exactly what is wrong. I want to bring technology to bear into my head, into my hands, such that I look at you and I look at the whole of you, I understand the capacity of you to heal and particularly to regenerate. I look down into the wound, the cells within the wound, the genetic expression within the cells in the wound, and then come all the way back out and go, right, this is the task I have to deal with. This is the extent of the problem in this individual, personalised to that individual. And then I have to think about, okay, from there, in my next part of the car wash, I've got to remove that burn. And you'll see why. It's very toxic, it drives an extraordinarily inflammatory response that's beyond any other form of injury. And so, how do I remove it? Right now, and I've spent 30 years doing this. I take a very sharp knife and I cut until someone bleeds, and then I know it's alive. That cannot be subtle and can't go in the same sentence, right? It is not subtle. I cut till the wound bleeds. The wound bleeds, I know the cells are alive underneath that, and therefore I've done the job and I've removed the dead tissue. There has to be a better way of doing that. Absolutely has to be. And here I've thought autolytic inflammatory control techniques with image-guided physical methodology, oscillating nanoblades, linked to OCT so that you actually can run it over like a lawnmower and actually drive that debridement at the right level histologically. And then I wake up. And then in the third part of the car wash, because I know exactly what I have to do, because I've got all these imaging technologies, I know exactly what I've got to do, and I know exactly what I've got to remove, I then rebuild. And that's when it gets exciting. Why do we heal by scarring? Why can't we regenerate? And so looking at self-assembling nanoparticles to provide a framework to guide the cells to express the appropriate phenotype for three-dimensional skin reconstruction is the dream, is the holy grail. And there's no point in doing any of that unless you can translate it to the bedside, and there is no way any of this can be done. And a lot of these things have been moved along, as I'll explain, without a multidisciplinary team. The other thing I'd like to put on the table, and I think it's really important to bring us together from a clinical perspective and a science perspective. I've got problems, I know the solutions are out in different heads, and I want people to come and play with me, but if I get caught up in thinking that I'm doing as good as can be done, if I think the gold standard, I'm achieving it, then I don't need to go any further. It is a very dangerous place to be. In my opinion, the gold standard for skin repair, right here, right now, in burns, is a split thickness skin graft. Taking a shave off a non-injured area, usually the thigh, and putting it on the area that is burned. I've done that so many thousands of times, it's ridiculous, because I'm so old. And the first time I did it was 1981, and it was so exciting. Somebody actually let me do it. You know, I was like, whoa! And I obviously don't get out much. And so every single time I have left a scar. Sometimes the scars are very good quality, they blend well, but point of fact, I've left a scar. So if I say that this is the gold standard, I've trapped myself into thinking we're good enough. I have stopped thinking of how to do better. I've stopped exploring the boundaries. And the gold standard, the gold standard has to be normal skin of that body side for that age of the patient. And since I'm a plastic surgeon, if we could turn back time a bit, you know, bonus. And so understanding that really changes the game. It changes the way you think about things, and it changes the drive to collaborate. It changes the drive to ask the question. And then you have to think about, okay, if I really want to achieve this, I have to understand that there is an opportunity at every point, at every intervention along the point from injury to full recovery. There is an opportunity to improve the quality of that outcome. And so there's an opportunity, again, to collaborate in a broader sense. So when we look at regenerative medicine, I think it's really interesting now that I've been in this space for over 20 years, but understanding that the cells themselves in the cell-based therapies have the capacity to regenerate in a way that we really don't understand yet. We've got bits and glimpses of things, of pathways, of responses, of the inflammatory response or the remodeling response, but point of fact is the cells can, in the right environment, can do a whole lot better than we do with all our alternatives, whether they be synthetic, allograft, xenograft, or whatever. And so right now, this is where we start. This is where I started a lot of time ago with this boy in 1985. I've carried him around with me in my mind and in the slides, because this is what burns from a very simple skull injury could look like if we took our eye off the ball and we slipped back in time. We have to think about how we can improve that at every step of the way, from injury prevention, first aid, the immediate care, wound minimization, all the way through to the interventions. And When I first started in 1985, I gave myself a 20-year time frame in order to regenerate. He probably wouldn't look very nice with a few limbs on him, but you know, the regeneration was where I was thinking that we had to go, and it was underestimating the task. Because yes, we've made a difference, and this is another one of my favourites, because we've made a difference, absolutely. And we've moved the goalposts, but we've not moved them enough, and we're not consistent enough. And so, what a beautiful thing is skin. It helps to keep the body in. It is an underrated organ. I'm sure none of you think about it in the way you think about the heart, the liver, the lung, the brain. You don't need much damage to really cause you a problem. And particularly in context. I would expect a 10% body surface area burn in a young person in our space right here, right now, to actually be a very simple thing to deal with. You put that burn in an 80-year-old, it is a fatal injury. You put that burn in many places in the world, and it can be a fatal injury. And if that person with that burn at any age gets an infection, it can be a fatal injury. You know, so you don't need much skin to really start to wobble the wheels because of the functionality of skin. You become leaky on the outside, leaky on the inside. The inflammatory response is driven such that you get secondary problems in all other organs. So, what about the scar-free healing? As a clinician, I am absolutely obsessed with meticulous attention to detail. We have to use what we know, and this is a really challenging one. When we know there is so much information that has been transferred into knowledge out there in the literature, in other environments, that is not in clinical practice. I mean, there's an awful lot written about this at the moment. How do we translate our current knowledge base to impact clinical care, right, in a whole range of fields? And so trying to understand that translation is another big area of work. To optimize the system that you work in, all the way down to the system of the human system, that body, and then the systems within the healing of that particular wound. But when we start to push the boundaries, it gets interesting and exciting. And so we start to think about what we need for wound healing. And if I was speaking to you 10 years ago, we'd have had a shorter list. We'd have had the source of cells capable of differentiation, and that is into skin, of course, and a framework capable of supporting those cells whilst they express their phenotype and developed into skin. But we are all self-organizing. We organize this shape all the way through life. We are recognizable, we age clearly, we may change in sort of this way, but we actually are recognizable and continue to self-repair over time. It slows as we age, but we are somewhere. We house the information for that self-organization. So where is that three-dimensional spatial information housed for self-organization? If anybody can answer that question, I'd be very happy. And if we find the source of that, the drive, then where are the feedback mechanisms? And we'll come to those in a minute. So we'll start with the cells, because that's what I thought I'd cover off, because we're known for this, and we've done a lot of work in this space, and this is where we started. We started looking at autologous cells. I was, again, very focused on autologous work. I didn't want allograft. Allograft causes an inflammatory response that drives a scar, poor outcome, and so we've always been in the allograft space. There's a lot of other people will do allograft fibroblasts or keratinocytes, accepting they're temporary, but we have always been in this allograft space, autograft space. Looking at the patient's needs, bringing together this triangle of care. What's your experience? What's your environment of care as well? Because that's the system you work in. We have a system over here in Fiona Stanley that I have the likes of which I've never seen a better place in the world. Whatever it says in West Australia, yeah? And so it's really, there is everything that we need in order to deliver the current state-of-the-art clinical burns care. That's not a privilege that everybody enjoys, and then that adapts what you can do. Whether you can actually do a major debridement requiring the whole theatre environment of heated to 32 degrees with blood warmers, etc. on tap, there's a whole lot of factors in your environment that dictate what you can actually deliver. So in order to look at this, we have to understand all aspects of that triangle to deliver the outcome. And so this is where we started. With cultured epithelial autograft sheets in 1990, some images from the first patient done in Western Australia. She was done when I was a registrar. She had a 70% burn. She was 56, and she was 5 months post-injury when I heard they were growing skin in Melbourne. And we sent, Ansett in fact flew the skin cells over, and then flew the sheets in the tissue flasks back 3 weeks later with Joanne Pavlanescu, the scientist working on this at the time, and John Masterton, the prof of the unit in the Alfred. We put all the skin cells on the lady in question. She was ventilated in intensive care. She healed, but unfortunately died 2 months later while she was rehabilitating on the burns unit on the ward. As she was walking down the corridor with the physios, she collapsed, and we could resuscitate her. And on post-mortem, she had a mycetoma in the right atrium. Not long after, I met Marie Stoner, who was working in the bone marrow lab at the time, and I saw her working through the night, and I would work through the night to get the skin would be flown back, the cells would be flown back from Melbourne, work through the night. She'd be getting the bone marrows ready, I'd be getting the skin ready, go home for breakfast, come back, do the day's surgery. Not sustainable, but I met somebody who was equally crazy, and so we worked together as we got the funding for the first lab in 1993. And this was a big issue. I can't wait that long. And so Marie and I, first off, got everything that was written about cultured skin. And we actually, at that time, we had a very small office in 1993. We were able to put everything on the floor. And we worked out what everybody did that was quick. Everybody's tweak that made it a bit quicker. And we threw in a few of our own. And our first, and I said to Marie, we can't do this in 10 days, it's useless. And so no pressure. So the first cab off the rank in February '93 was 10 days. Interestingly, we noticed that when the skin cell sheets were really fragile, the wound quality was better. The healed wound was better. So we did a whole lot of work looking at the various integrins, the adhesion molecules, looking at the different beds we could grow the skin cells over, coating the flask with the irradiated 3T3 fibroblasts was a standard that gave us the fastest growth, and that's the standard of practice around the world. But then using laminin, collagens, all sorts of different things, and we realized that the cells as individuals had much stickier boots on, and were able to hang on to the wound and integrate in a way that when we were transferring sheets, they blistered off and were much more fragile. And so we very quickly got to the stage where we were harvesting the cells in a subconfluent, the publication at the bottom, in a subconfluent way, and then putting the cells on as a suspension. And then we were in a situation where I came out of theatre one day, and we're not sure which one of us said it, and I was come out of theatre where I was in the sweat box, I was a dripping mess, and Marie's very ethereal, beautiful underneath the UV hoods and air conditioning, and I was just like, oh, it was a bit of a long day. And one of us said, oh, we should just spray this stuff on. And it was a bit like a cartoon. As the dust settled, we'd gone. We were down in Subi, she went to Subi and went to the pharmacy in the Arch store. I was upstairs raiding the anaesthetic trolleys and finding everything that could spray. Hairspray, throat spray, nose spray, any kind of spray you like. But this comes from Italian mouth freshener that we found in the pharmacy on Rockaby Road. This is like, it's ridiculous, isn't it? That constitutes like probably 2 years of our life, you know? You know the deal, though. Spraying cells through, looking at the trypan blue, looking at the coliform assays. Oh, is this a good one? What was so good was we were able to clip it onto a standard 5mm syringe. There was no dead space, and we couldn't, even our most robust registrar, pushing as hard as they could, couldn't kill the cells coming through that system. You can in a 2mm syringe, you can kill it all. But you know, it's really interesting that we became amateurs on vortexing and apertures and nozzles, And some years later, I was asked to open the international conference at the Perth Convention Centre on aerosols in medicine. And I thought, oh, right, I can't remember who asked me to do it. I think it might be Steve Stickers, my mate who does asthma. We were at med school together. And I go, I'll open your conference for you. But I'll cry, because had I known you'd existed, it would have been a whole lot easier. Because apart from anything, we didn't speak Italian. And so we had boxes and boxes of mouthwash in the corner in the lab, as we just pulled the nozzles off and sterilised them in the hospital autoclave. And finally, we did find somebody who was our first fellow, Remo Papini. I said, with a name like that, if you don't speak Italian, go back to Birmingham. And so he got us just the nozzles. And so we were able then to spray the cells on. We also did at that stage a lot of work looking at what we sprayed it on with, to try and get the cells to stick. But then we realised that that was unnecessary. We were drawing blood, spinning it down, taking off autologous serum, mixing it with the serum. And then we looked at the wounds, and there's plenty of serum sitting there. And so we dispensed with that stage. Did a whole lot of work, and I think that brings the point of collaboration. Had I sort of had the time or the inclination to look at the aerosols in medicine issue, I would have found somebody who could have significantly truncated that piece of work. And we went to the TGA and trying to get this the whole system through approvals in our lab, and we had no significant robust animal models because we had no funding to do this. And so then, by this stage, I was doing work with the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, in Harvard. My mate there, who now is the chief of plastics over there, was in a position where he had the funding to do the animal models. So we did matched wounds down the back of the pig, mesh skin grafts with spray cells over. And where we sprayed the cells, you can see that we've got a dermal epidermal junction developing in contrast to this where it heals by secondary intention. And then there was a whole lot of independent assays done by an independent pathologist, such that we could be sure that we were actually doing something with this whole system. Because when we spray the cells over a wide mesh graft, if you leave a wide mesh graft on somebody, they look like a crocodile. And it's a standard technique of closing a large wound. It's ugly, and it contracts, and it causes functional disability. But you've not much choice if you've got a massive burn, if you've only got one donor site. So what we were doing was spreading this out and spraying over the top. And we see clinically that the mesh pattern fades. And so this was the experimental work that we then went back and did that demonstrated what it was that we were doing at the time. We also noticed clinically that our patients were the right colour and that we were seeing less hyperpigmentation as well. And so we did the similar thing in Harvard with the spotted pig. And so you can see some of the skin grafts are taken from the black areas on the pig. And so we have the question we asked, can we transfer melanocytes from the arrows? You can see, yes, the non-pigmented group at the top, pigmented group at the bottom, and that those melanocytes were functional within the skin construct of healing and were able to produce melanin. And over a 6 to 12 week period, clinically, you see the colour up. And so we were able to say, yes, we're transferring melanocytes and we're appropriately colouring the body. We also looked at different body sites. One of the things, if I had the money, I'd love to characterise the difference in the skin and the different body sites, because the eyelid hardly scars. But here and here scar like there's no tomorrow. Why? You know, I mean, there's got to be so much knowledge trapped in the fact that we haven't had the opportunity to analyse it at the sort of levels that now we can, but if we had the funding. So from a reconstructive point of view, with this hand, this little child who's fallen into a fire, I've taken skin from the sole of the foot to repair the palm of the hand. And I've taken skin from the buttock to repair the back. But I've done it with a mesh, dermis, and cells sprayed over, again, and cells sprayed over. So matching the site of the cells with your recipient site changes the character of what we can achieve. You can't cover much of an area from the sole of the foot because we take the instep, but when you can expand your surface area of cover by dissociating the cells and using the body as the tissue culture environment, then you can get more cover. and it becomes, your risk analysis changes and it becomes more, though you get more options. Like with the face, I take it from behind the ear for the face. And so we started putting cells from, as you can see here, this is a thick scale from the sole of the foot, a normal cell with cytokeratin 9 staining. This is thin skin with no cytokeratin 9. And this is the elbow, which is a thin skin area where we've covered it with thick skin from the sole of the foot for wear and tear. And so we were able to track cytokeratin 9 on this particular case report, so we could see that yes, the cells are sticking there and they're part of the construct going forward. Looking at then trying to figure out what was happening to the whole healing trajectory, it is really challenging. When all our patients come in, the assessment part of the car wash is so important. When that happens, when we get that, it'll be a real backflip with triple twist on it, because everybody is different. But one wound that we have that is relatively controlled is a donor site. And this is the donor site we've taken. We've put skin cells on the donor site, on half and not on the others. And you can see your healing trajectory comes together, as you'd expect, because this is a wound that should heal. But using transepidermal water loss and capacitance over the surface, we can track the changes, and we can see how the speed to healing is influenced by the introduction of the cells. So this is 15 years of life in one picture, from the cell sheets to the fragile cell sheets, from 3 weeks to 10 days, down to 5 days, and then we realised that our patients where we're growing cells in 5 days are looking better than our smaller patients where we're doing traditional technique, and so we put the first steps of the tissue culture process in the kit, and that takes 20 minutes, and we use it at the bedside. So we have an enzyme that we worked with CSL to get the enzyme in a condition that would split the dermal epidermal junction the fastest without secondary consequences. We have a Hartmann's solution that negates the effect of the trypsin by the calcium. We filter with a cell filter, and the whole process takes about 20 minutes. And we can harvest then cells and use them immediately, and we use the body as the tissue culture environment. As I say, that's 15 years in one breath. And this is how we would get someone healed with the surface technology within the epidermis, and we'd link it with, in this case, some of the technologies that we use is a template. This is a collagen and glycosaminoglycans template that is temporary for 3 weeks, and then we repair the surface over it, and it allows the scar to soften and grow with the patient, as you can see this child over time. We can use the cells on their own in bigger areas. This is a 80% burn. His legs have been used, the template, Integra. He's got skin from his back on his arms, and then you can see this is an escharotomy to allow him to breathe in the acute phase, and then we put cells over the surface there to achieve healing. But one of the things about this whole business is we're taking skin from normal sites. And again, this was going back in time, this was a big driver. This is a donor site scar that I did on a young boy by taking a traditional split thickness skin graft. You can see in some people that is seriously detrimental. So we start to go back and look at the whole concept of cell-based therapies in the partial thickness burns, where we can take what we know from the laboratory, that we can get them to stick onto all sorts of things. So can we get these cells to stick on a dermis that we don't debride down, that we don't throw away the tissue that can possibly be salvaged? And so it again brings us back to the first part of the car wash that is so important in understanding the assessment in order then to prepare the wounds. And so this is our practice right now, where we've got an 18-month-old toddler with a partial thickness burn. The shoulder is the deepest, as you can see there, across there. It's the thin, it gets more superficial as it gets pinker going down the chest. Our aim is to do this within the first week, and this is what happens by 6 months. 80% of our children are like this now. Pediatric scalds where we've made the biggest progress. We've still got kids that scar, and particularly with flame burns, and we've changed the goalpost. We've had a sniff at what is possible. but it's not, we can't get it to be consistent. It's about 50% of our adults are like this. We don't know why the other 50% aren't. And I say inflamed, where your temperature differential is different, and trying to salvage tissue that is more, where the collagen is denatured, becomes really challenging. But then you get surprises, and this is an acid burn to the back. When we see white, we know it's really bad news. Pink's good, white's bad, black is really bad. And so you can see this is a wound that we've been able to salvage with just spray-on cells. From a postage stamp size, we've been able to cover that area. And try to understand why this individual with a burn that should not have ended up like this has gone this way is part of what we're really interested in going forward. Because we don't understand what it is to that. I would do the same thing for 10 people and get 10 outcomes. Sure, now our outcomes have moved to a better end of the spectrum than they were 20 years ago, but we still have that differential outcome that's beyond our control. So, I think somebody could talk about this, Natalie, more than me. This is work done way back, looking at how we can salvage more tissue, looking at how we can manipulate that collateral damage from the inflammatory response that's really massive in burns, so we can salvage the tissue by manipulation of the different pathways. And this is an animal experiment where you can see, yes, we can get a better quality healing if we introduce an inhibitor of the C-jump pathway. And there's, I think, oh, I thought I've got your MT stuff in there, sorry. And so, looking at the different pathways, we can now, with understanding, start to target the different levels. And I know there's many people, as I say, in the room that know more about this than I do. But look at this. The impact of first aid. This is a paper we just got published this year based on the data across Australia and New Zealand for 5 years, where patients have had adequate first aid, which is clean, cool running water for 20 minutes in the first 1 hour of injury, between 15 and 18 degrees. There's a lot of the team doing the basic science in Queensland have demonstrated, again, this cooling influences the pathways. There's a lot of interest around cooling right now. We cool the burn, warm the patient. And as I said yesterday, and then we take them into an operating room and kind of cook them. We keep them high, keep the temperature high, because if the temperature falls, then they don't clot and they bleed out. But if we change our surgical approach and cool the surface actively whilst maintaining the core temperature, will we be able to get a better outcome? These questions, I think, have really come back on the table, because if you look at this, this is absolutely barn door, that your length of stay is decreased, your infection rates decreased, and your need for surgery is decreased because you're salvaging tissue. That is from a simple strategy. How can we add to this by our pathway manipulation? We've got to do the basics first and then add icing on the cake. So, when we look at the capacity to manipulate these things with growth factors and manipulating the adhesion, then we know that the cells will change. But they will also change related to the architectural framework that they're put in. And so we know we have a lot of work done looking at the micron level with this Integra is the template I showed you earlier. The cells grow into that template. It is a felted structure that's collagen and glycosaminoglycans with an average pore size of 80 microns. If it's 60 or 120, all you get is disordered granulation tissue. At the pore size of 80, with that chemistry, what you get is dermal regeneration. No hair follicles, no sweat glands, but it's indistinguishable from reticular dermis on the microscope. So it's tissue-guided regeneration in its infancy, if you like. So we know that the micron level has a profound effect on the cell activity. So we start to think about how can we improve this technique, because Integra is two-stage. We get the dermis right, the deep layers of skin, then we come back 3 weeks later and get the epidermis right. So here we've put cells from the ReCell kit underneath on the wound and allowed them to migrate through the dermal construct to self-organize into an epidermal layer and push off the silicon pseudo-epidermis. This is, again, animal work done with the team in Boston. And we're now trying to work out what the dose relationship is to get this system optimized so that we can put the two technologies together. The nanoscale is another area that we've sort of flirted with, looking at how the cells change are related to the nanopore structure. This is work done some years ago now, where particularly, where is it, Lee Parkinson, he was a very nomadic student. He started at Curtin, and then Murdoch, and then UWA, and now he's in Canada. And so he was looking at changing the pore size of the template by changing the pH and electric current across that pore, across the construct as it was self-organizing, and we could see that we had a differential rate of growth of the cells over the surface. We still work with the nanochemistry team in UWA, where we're looking at using nanomagnetic particles as a to direct the cells across, and this is work we've done in the lab. We've gone into the animal model, but not into the human yet. But this is the idea of using nanomagnetic particles to drive cells into the right place and then trigger them appropriately by that differential environment. So now we come to the three-dimensional spatial information. Again, work done looking at the nerves. To put the background, this is these results are from 34 patients, at least 1 year post-injury, where they have been burnt and got a scar, and they've got a site-appropriate, non-injured, matched skin type, skin area. Well, I won't say control, because they're changed. And we can see, from a functional perspective, light touch or two-point discrimination, where we have scarred, the quality of the function is statistically significantly decreased. But the most interesting thing about this whole work is that the nerve density, when measured, falls away very strongly related to the body surface area. But it's not only the nerve density of the scar, it's the nerve density of the non-scarred matched area. So if I'm burnt here, our nerve density changes here. Very difficult for us to get this one over the line. We had help from Curtin with the hierarchical mathematics, and we couldn't get it published until, oh sorry, I thought I got that there, until we did a parallel, an animal model where we took a biopsy before the burn, and the burn was 1 centimetre on the back of a small rodent, and within 2 weeks the nerve density on the whole of the back of that skin, wherever we looked, it was decreased. So there was clearly something happening remote from the injury. So the question we're asking is, are we able to understand where the three-dimensional information comes from, where the drivers are? We've just, one of our students, veterans, just finished his PhD looking at the dorsal root ganglion changes relative to the skin burn. This is a snapshot of another PhD student who looked at transcranial magnetic stimulation in single upper limb burns. This is just one person who had a previous single upper limb. As you can see, it's a different position there, looking at the threshold to stimulation, and the map of the TMS is different here in this person who's had a previous, I think 5 or 7 years, this particular one, upper limb injury that was fully functional at this time. So is the three-dimensional information housed here? We know that plasticity is something that possibly is an opportunity to harness. It is something that is of interest to us. But where we go next, I don't know. There's a couple of people here working on this with us at the moment, trying to understand the changes. Certainly the changes acutely we see with pain, and the changes chronically with pain are well described with phantom limbs and things. But how this can be utilised clinically is of interest to us. Can we unscar the scar? Clearly this is a demonstration, yes, that if you sand and respray with a small biopsy from the back of this ear, you can change the quality of the scar over the surface. Again, we can do this 80% of the time in 80% of people, but we can't do it consistently. And so we're trying to look at why, and what is it that makes somebody more liable to be scarred than others, And so we've started looking at the epigenetics, and particularly the methylation patterns, looking at scars, the scars related to the keloid scars related to normal scar fibroblasts, and looking at the differential methylation, and then trying to then interrogate those pathways to see if we can find an opportunity to then influence that therapeutically. We come to one of the other issues is measurement of what we've done. Measurement at the outset is important, measurement at the conclusion of our treatment is important. And so one of the things that we do is work with the biomedical engineers at UWA, looking at the OCT, and this is looking, as you can see, at the difference between a hypertrophic scar and a normotrophic scar. And you can see there are significant differences in the vasculature, and we see differences in the collagen and the collagen birefringence, and that organisation that allows us to track our therapies. And this is particularly important because now we're looking at this scar, for example, we're starting to use fractional laser where we drill micro holes, tiny holes in this, and we see there's changes functionally and changes aesthetically. And so we can back that up by looking at the structural changes without biopsies, and our biopsies can go down the epigenetic route. And so, as this is indicating, with our pre and post laser ablation. So we can trying to drive to this normal vascular pattern from this abnormal scar vascular pattern. So it gives us some idea of what we're doing underneath the surface. And all of this functional outcomes are really important, psychological outcomes are important, so we collect a lot of data, and I think the point of that is to come to this. That is probably the longest introduction in the world, right? Because this is where I really would like your help. So, some time ago, I met a young boy who died of a hepatocellular carcinoma as an 11-year-old. As an 8-year-old, in 2003, he'd had an 80% body surface area burn, flame burn. Significant infection, it was a farming accident, so it had, that's not mine, promise. It had rolled in the dirt, lots of interesting bugs related to chicken manure, so it was complex, yet he survived very well. Only to then represent with tightness in his right upper quadrant, and it was a tumour rather than the skin being tight relative to his growth. So the question that we asked at the time is there a relationship between surviving, and at that stage I asked the question, surviving major burns and a lifelong risk of malignancy? And can data linkage answer that question? And so with a lot of nagging and a lot of downwind, we did get an NHMRC in 2009, and we were able to link 30,000 burn hospitalisations in Western Australia with all the other health and geospatial databases. So we have 30,000 patients requiring hospitalisation for a burn injury, and we match them geospatial, socioeconomic, age, sex, with 120,000 people who have not been hospitalised. So they're our clean group, if you like. And yes, surviving a burn has an impact for life. But the interesting thing here is in the database, 96% of the children and 84% of the adults have burns less than 20% body surface area. 20% body surface area in our world constitutes a major burn. 20% would be both your arms and your face, one leg and up to here. Okay, that's 20%. That is a serious and, as I've indicated, life-threatening burn. Fortunately, for lots of reasons, where around occupational health and safety legislation, simple things like you don't see the cords on kettles the way you did when, I was a kid. The way that so you can't, they're tip-proof and all that kind of stuff. With nightgowns were flammable. When I first started, children from the knees to the chin, little girls, full thickness burns from nightgowns. Then there was change in the legislation so that there's flame retardant fabric. 3 years ago, because we don't see those burns anymore, there was a move in Australia to remove that legislation. And so we all came out and chained ourselves to the railings because we don't want to go back there. So big burns don't happen anywhere near as frequently. And so what surprised us was this. And so we also looked further. Now we've got maybe 17 publications around this now. And patients, for example, surviving burn injury and they're 65, their life expectancy drops from 12 to 7 years. And their problems are cardiovascular disease and malignancy. So when we start to hone in on the cardiovascular system, we're bringing together those three circles. We've seen from our population health that we've got a statistically increased admissions of myocardial infarct, stroke, and heart failure, and death from those three diagnoses in the group with burns relative to the group that have been non-injured and not hospitalized. We've then added this to undertaken an animal study with a 1 centimetre burn, which equates to a 4 centimetre body surface area burn. And in these animals, at 4 weeks, they have intraventricular hypertrophy, which we asked the cardiologist, is that important? And they will go, their eyes widened, because yes, it is. And so then they helped us do a study with clinical study of young men who were less than 15% body surface area burn, and they had echo changes and mild heart rate increases at 3 months post-injury. These are our easy group. So clearly there's something systemically going on. And whether we look, we've published on we've done the malignant codes, we've then gone the cardiovascular codes, we've done infection, gastrointestinal, neurological. So all the codes, the people that come in with codes related to neurological diagnoses have got a differential risk if they've had a previous burn. And so this is just the survival data from all those burned less than 15 years of age, and you see there's a difference in their Kaplan-Meier curve, and we're very conservative with all this, but with all our conservative numbering, 59 of these potentially could have been influenced if they hadn't been burned, but we don't know why. We've looked at different ways of trying to access and understand why. We've been supported by Woodside since the late 1990s because we sort of work on lots of different fronts, and one of the fronts that we're very active is disaster management and disaster planning. And that's the Woodside, in fact, was the reason, the funding from Woodside was the reason that we were able as a country to respond the way we did to the Bali bombing. Because in the late 1990s, we did the planning for the Woodside Northwest Shelf based because the North Rankin A rig on the Northwest Shelf is the same configuration as the one off Aberdeen, Pipe Alpha, that exploded at the late 80s. And so being involved in all that disaster management, they funded a national plan. That national plan went to the Health Ministers Advisory Council in July of 2002. It was all approved in August, and we responded in October, so it was very fresh in all our minds. But Woodside have been a partner ever since. They have funded all the population health research. And so they said, you guys have got lots of data now. Why we want to do a data hack. We've heard that these could be fun. And so before Christmas, we all went and they gave us 60 data specialists for the day. And we had 6 million data points from over 3,000 patients over 11 years. And we were able to interrogate this data, and it created a tsunami of work that we're still recovering from. And I'll just show some of the work that we were able to look at, and this is the time to healing. In my world, many people around the world will leave you for 3 weeks before they even start operating. In our world, we go here. We want it done at day 5, because we see that people start to scar, get out of our control very early. We don't know why somebody would scar very, very well when they've taken all this long time to heal, but equally, why would somebody scar really poorly when they've healed pretty quickly? And so, looking at the outcomes, this is a threshold map looking at 15%, the small burns, big burns, and our outcomes. Our outcomes are the top is good, the bottom is bad. So you can see this validates, this data hack demonstrates our smaller burns do better than our bigger burns in their functional, aesthetic and psychological outcomes. So we know that. But let's start investigating more thoroughly, and we start to look at cumulative outcomes, and we see if the surgery is done before 7 days, all our cumulative outcomes, with the exception of this, which we've gone back and interrogated, are statistically improved, and they're maintained out to the year, so people don't catch up. So removing the burn early makes a big difference. So again, a very long way of coming to you and telling you that a scar is abnormal, but you all know that. You can feel that. You've got a scar, you can see it's abnormal. It's abnormal in its architecture, its chemistry, and its cell phenotype. We know that. We've got very good data around the architectural changes, the chemical changes of the collagen and the various proteins within that, and the cross-linking patterns. We know the cell phenotype is different from our methylation pattern investigations with the epigenetics. But the scar being abnormal, that structure being abnormal, it is tolerated by our host immune system. So the question I'm asking is, what role does the change in the immune surveillance make in the long-term impact of this burn injury? This person who has accumulated a fingerprint of inflammation down here is seeing the consequences down here. Is it related to alterations in immune surveillance? But what is the role of stress and burn and cellular senescence? We know very clearly that stress has many impacts. The psychological stress, the stress of pain. There is no more stressful situation than finding yourself in an isolated burns unit, waking up after a couple of days and finding yourself with bandages from here to here in pain and being taken to the gym to do a workout, because that's what we do. And so is that unmasking the diseases of aging, and what impact does it have therefore on the cellular senescence? And I come back to without all this these questions and this knowledge, I started 30 years ago looking for regeneration, not scar repair. I want regeneration, not scar repair. I want people to look better, feel better, move better, the way they were before. What is the role of regeneration? Is that the answer or not? And despite regeneration, will we still get the chronic changes downstream? And how are we going to understand and unravel all this? One of the things that I've come across in my travels recently is interrogation of IBM Watson. It's got 26 million abstracts that I just couldn't quite get through. And so I wanted the malignancy particularly, and I think that should be, can you see? That is colon cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, skin, burns. And when you put these things in the system, you see which pathways light up. And when you put burns in there, you have a connectivity as well. What does this mean? I don't know, but I'm sure there's lots of very smart people in this room that can help me understand that, because this is where we're going. I've asked a lot more questions than I've answered. And I think one of the things in my mind that's really important is bringing us all together in that sort of clinical scientific technology interface, because we carry a lot of dead wood. We carry a lot of preventable pathology based on the choices each of us make. We can change that, and we need to change that if we want to tip this balance of the health budget, so we can really shift and drive the advance in technology in tomorrow. So that's where I'll finish, that, you know, in the operating room, because there has to be a better way than that. You can't say anything other than that is labour intensive. That is one of the patients from Bali. There was a lot of photographs taken at the time. Normally we've not such paparazzis on ourselves. But you can see there is an arm there, and there's a leg there. So there is, I promise, somebody in the middle of all that. But that's a huge investment, a huge sort of, just a huge amount of human energy, when we've got the technology, I'm sure, to do better. if we just look a little differently at the whole problem and bring these things, try to show how we bring these things together, but also how we need support, in particularly around the immune response. And one of the things, my apologies, I forgot to put in there, is one of the questions that we have asked is how do the children respond to their standard vaccinations? And we just had a telephone grant, and we just started recruiting 5-year-old children who have been burnt between the ages of 1 and 3 and had their standard vaccinations, with the trying to interrogate their response to the vaccination and match that with the telethon non-injured database. So there's an awful lot of opportunity to look way beyond. And I'll leave you with the image of Australia Day 2003, and all those flares indicate someone who didn't come home from their holiday party. Thank you. So I've probably talked about nothing you wanted me to talk about. Sorry.
No, that was great, thanks. I was wondering if you could maybe enlighten us in terms of what the natural history, what's known about the immunology following an acute burn. And is there any evidence that there is a period of measurable immune activation that actually is persistent over time, or that could actually explain some of the events that you spoke to?
Most of the work that's been done to date has been in the massive burns and comes out of the US pediatric units in Galveston, where they see in burns over 50% you have changes that would indicate an ongoing inflammatory response. We've done some work, and I just, as I say, I apologise, I realised I got to the end there, and I think the vital bit that I didn't put in was some of the immunology work we've done. And one of the things that we've done is look at this 1 centimetre wound versus burn versus excision, a surgical excision. And in all the parameters, the cytokines and the T cells that we were able to interrogate, we saw that the burn wound was had a much more florid and extensive and maintained response in the animal model than an excision wound. We then did a second experiment where we excised the wound at 2 days, so we burnt day 1, excised at day 2 or day 6, because excision adds an insult to the injury, and that's what we're doing clinically. If we excised at day 2 versus day 6, we were able to control the ongoing inflammation of the burn, but we were also and the immune response. But the changes that we thought were attributable to the excision at 2 days were less than when we excised at 6 days. So leaving the burn intact and leaving that sort of interface does drive that sort of inflammatory response. And clinically in our major burns, we see their white counts and everything, they respond, their CRP goes up, and when it starts to fall, we know we're in trouble. And that's when we've left the burn on too long. And so I see that less now because we go early and try and remove all the burn early. But then we have to put something in its place. And something in its place sometimes isn't easy, because if our first grafting attempts with a combination of the synthetics and the cells gets infected, then we have somebody who's naked. And then it starts all over again.
And is that process is measurably different depending on the thickness
Yes.
of the burn as well?
Yeah.
And my other question was, in terms of repopulation of the skin with normal protective cells, like for instance skin resident memory T cells, is there any information on how that process occurs, or are there inter-individual differences in that process in terms of actually the normal cells we suspect to be protecting, I guess, against infection and day-to-day mischief?
We do see our infection is I'm just trying to work out, because after we spoke, I've kind of tried to get as much information, look and see. Nobody seems to have actually specifically looked structurally at the intact skin construct. We know that the cells themselves, the defensins on the keratinocytes, do not recover. and they're not equivalent to a non-scarred area. And that the defensins, so the sort of, that are in a burn, relative to a burn area here, the defence area of the keratinocytes, the defensins, are influenced and changed remotely from a burn site as well, in the acute sense, and over time it doesn't appear to recover, and the time frame being about a year that people have looked. People haven't looked longer, because it's until we started presenting this work, people didn't think of looking longer in anybody other than the massive burns. And then when we start to think about the other, trying to get other bits of information, one thing we've done is we've given a mouse a viral load, a respiratory viral load, after a 1 centimetre burn and control, and we can see that the lung responses are much more florid if you've had a previous burn. So we know that the systemically they're changed, and the indication is that cutaneously they're changed. But nobody's looked in that in the construct itself. They've looked at the disaggregated cellular level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunity to actually try and unravel this.
Thanks, Fiona. That was great and inspiring as always. Thank you very much. I had 2 questions. One, the very interesting suggestion that the risk of malignancy is increased further down the track, suggesting that there may be one of the consequences of the burn may be impairing immune surveillance. And with that in mind, have you looked at the incidence of other immune-mediated diseases, autoimmune disease, for example, in addition to malignancy, that might be worth considering? The second question, the tantalising changes in nerve fibre density, even in the normal, non-burnt limb, which is, I've heard you talk about before, and is really very, very hard to find an explanation for, but suggests, as you say, a remote effect like that maybe suggests some humoral factor. I can't remember whether you've looked at growth factors, nerve growth factors such as NGF or BDNF in that sort of situation. That might be worth looking at.
It is. I'm smiling because the nerve growth factor trying to stimulate and change the nerve density was and we thought a very good NHMRC that got struck out 3 times, but, and so that's still on the table. We will still keep going and looking at the bits and pieces of the nerves that we've been able to look at is very tiny bits here and there. Is we know that there's changes in the skin density. We know there's changes in the dorsal root ganglia. We know there's some cerebral changes. How it all links and how we can manipulate that and improve it is something that I think is, as I say, it's on our radar, and it's all a money sort of issue, trying to get the funding to do the work. And so we sort of chip in at it. And it's really interesting to me that it's more than what the scar is, because one of the ways of going forward in these circumstances is with our students, our med students come along and we go, these are our very best lower limb scars. You have to check with the photograph where the burn is. Single legs. So we get all these single leg men together, 30 odd of them, and we get this other leg, and we go, right, do the functional testing of the neurology of these legs. And they're statistically different in where you can't hardly see the scar. So there's something going on that persists, and this is all at a year. And so one of the things that's we're just going through ethics for is to try and stimulate electrically in the dressings. So you can put electric current through our dressings like the TENS machine, and we're thinking, well, do we change the pain profile? Can we actually change the cellular response profile? And doing a sort of electrical dressing approach, and then trying to measure the changes that has. And that's one of the things that we've just got a little bit of funding for, so we'll go and do that. So it's scattergun because of the funding situation. The rheumatoid that's just in process. All the autoimmune diseases, because we've gone through each group, and there'll be that data analysis is currently being done. Then the next bit of data analysis that's going, I think that's the last cab off the rank, and then we're going through looking at 30,000 burned, and we've done a lot of injury severity scoring, 30,000 people that have got injury severity equivalent but not non-burn, non-skin involvement. And then the 120 non-burn, non-injured. So is it burn injury or is it injury? We'll be able to answer that as well.
With the malignancy, I presume you looked at hematological.
Yeah, only 11% of those malignancies are skin. It's across the board. One of the things about the nerve fibres that we think may be the reason is actually the change in the extracellular matrix systemically. There's a group that have been working on a heavy water system of measuring collagen turnover in the extracellular matrix, and we've been in discussions with them, and we've got access to heavy water here, so we'll be measuring each other's extracellular matrix in the very near future, because is that the systemic change in our extracellular matrix to that inflammatory insult may secondarily influencing the nerve density. That's one of the things that we're exploring as well. Any ideas, we're welcome.
Maybe just a quick question to follow up on. There's a question about tissue-resident T cells, because there's, Rachel Clark and so on, they've done all these nice parabiotic experiments where they can show that, and also Frank Caponi on the mice models, which show that the tissue-resident T cells are very good at finding their way around the skin. So you would think that after a burn, you would think that the tissue-resident T cells who are basically stuck in the epidermis have got nowhere else to go other than migrate, and they interact with the epidermal cells. You would hope that they would repopulate from the normal skin. And in terms of trying to answer that, if you didn't have direct experimental data from biopsying whether they've repopulated or not, people haven't done that. It's a more obvious experiment. Is there anything clinically to guide you? So, for example, when you see a burn limb or acute versus non, what do you see clinically that's different in the area of burn versus not, in terms of, say, recurrence of HSV or zoster or response clinically to infection? Is there any clues clinically that you would have as to, how that skin is behaving compared to the contralateral normal side?
We see a fragility is how I can to say in the early if we work really hard to get it epithelialized, but that's not where it stops, because we've got to keep the epithelium tight, and it sometimes looks like the moths have been in it, and it crumbles, and it's not always obvious why. One of the things I've been sort of trying to think about is that intrinsic blistering disorder related to their genetics. Because epidermolysis bullosa has been a broad spectrum. Are we in a situation that they're crumbling and secondary blistering is a structural thing as opposed to an infective thing? The majority, I think, are infective, and staph is the usual culprit, staphylococcal, easy. But also we've increasingly seen herpes, particularly on face burns. They heal, and we think, yes, great, we've got them done, and because we drive faces really hard to try and get them healed quickly, because then they actually get the bonus of looking about 10 years younger, see, as well. And but then, in some people, we've seen it much more frequently than, I would have seen this once every 2 or 3 years. Then you see the vesicles come in, and it just all comes off. And then we're back down, we start again. And that is more frequent than it used to be. And we're more attuned to it, so we get positive virology on those because we're looking for it now. Is it because we didn't look before? That's why I'm hesitating, because now we look, we see it. So there are a group of people that have certainly got, in that early healed phase, a fragility around them that indicates that their skin is not functioning in a protective way in a normal sense. And then we protect from a physical point of view, and from a moisture control point of view, edema control, and infection control. So hygiene is hugely important, and that's really difficult because it hurts, and so showering with chlorhexidine and all that kind of stuff is really challenging, but if you don't do it, then your staff sort of general commensal load builds up everywhere else, then your area will break down. So there's a lot of clinical indications that that's the case, but measuring it and identifying who will be in that space proactively is really, I think, important to take us to the next step.
So with the epidemiological studies that you've done, can you get a sense of how a burns patient that's been under intensive management for a month would fare in relation to cardiovascular risk, cancer risk, etc., to say an age-matched control in an intensive care unit who's been in intensive care for another reason like sepsis or, you know, another trauma?
Yes, we're not, but not right yet. We have one of the intensive care consultants has just started working with us answering this question, because particularly the people who have septic are in ICU for sepsis appear to be the closest group to the burns on superficial epidemiological sort of scanning. And so we're trying to work out how we can quarantine groups. And in my head I had the idea that we look at lung sepsis, because pneumonia is common, cardiac surgery because it's clean, and compare that with burns. But the cardiac surgery is too successful now. And so when we're looking at things, the gross parameters of mortality, then the mortality is very low. Whereas the sepsis group is much more like our burns. And so we started looking at, well, okay, sepsis, it'll be lung sepsis is a group that we're looking at comparing, and that can be identified across the whole of the national ICU database. And so the other area is from GI. And I think that will be another group which is endothelial, inflammatory, and is that in the same ballpark as we see with our burns. So I don't know yet, but that's one of the pathways we've been started to move down with our collaborations, because they've got huge databases in the intensive care that really can give us an awful lot of information. And that's where, of course, the big TENS patients go as well.
Right.
And so that to get at that information, I think, again, it's going to have to be a national approach from now. So
right, because TENS patients also don't have normal one-year outcomes in terms of they have some of the increases in some of these other morbidities and mortalities as well.
But what fascinates me is they don't scar that.
Yeah, they tend
It's
to
really
use
hard to get them to
epidermal.
scar. Yeah, I mean, even I wouldn't leave somebody unhealed. I would be in operating. Whereas with the TENS, we just we know they're okay. We very rarely operate on them. They have, and so on our graph of time to healing, they're a different trajectory, which I think is fascinating again to compare.
Just another quick one, Fiona, on whether there are long-lasting effects on immune function. Is it known whether burns victims are more likely to develop immune-mediated or allergic skin diseases further down the track?
I don't know the
Like
answer
TENS,
to
for
that.
example.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we certainly haven't got enough TENS in our database to link that.
Or even eczema or
Eczema and asthma,
arthritis
that's a different story. Yeah, in the we've looked at our children who have poor scars, and they have disproportionately they've got asthma or eczema. 40% of them have got asthma or eczema, whereas 12% of the population have asthma or eczema. If the scars that are so bad, we've taken them back to theatre as to do reconstructive surgery or injection or whatever, those people have got a much higher risk, those children have got a higher risk of having asthma or eczema. And so that's led to another collaboration with Steve Stick, who's the asthma specialist, because they see the respiratory mucosa in the asthma patients. When they do a scratch assay, it is slow to proliferate and to heal relative to normal bronchial mucosa. So we're tagging along there, and does a burn influence that even further?
Well, good. Smoke inhalation would be another relevant factor there.
Smoke inhalation is an interesting one, because we don't see hardly any of that anymore. It's touch wood, that's going to be a bad night tonight. But we sort of the incidence of patients coming in with a good going smoke inhalation burn in our environment has fallen absolutely, really radically, because our respiratory diagnosis codes. We had trouble getting that published because they kept sending back questions about respiratory inhalation injury. We go, but no, this is a group without inhalation injury, because we took anybody, all our patients who are ventilated go to ICU. And so we could clearly take them out. So we knew the others didn't have smoke inhalation. And in the end, we sort of said, okay, right, we'll put that piece of work with the respiratory viral load so that you can see what we're trying to get at. It's not a smoke inhalation issue, because we just didn't have enough. In 8 years, we have 64 patients ventilated, of which 12 of them were smoke inhalation, because they're ventilated for other reasons. Ventilated for head and neck burns is our most common. You're ventilated for volume change, not for smoke inhalation in our environment, for transfer. Because if you're burnt in aspirins and you've got an 8-hour transfer, during that 8 hours, you can actually swell up 10 litres, because we have to give that aggressive fluid resuscitation to maintain the urine output. And during that time, you can lose your airway if you've not got a tube in. So that's the commonest reason we would ventilate. And we ventilate a lot less than most people across Australia and the world anyway. So we know our smoke inhalation is very low.
Well, thank you again. That was,
Really, if anybody's got any good ideas, we're always welcome.